All right. Well, great. Thank you all so much for being with us today. I'm really thrilled to announce this session where our DBSA Young Adult Council member will be discussing transition ages, challenges facing young adults living with depression and bipolar. My name is Hannah Zeller. I'm the programs manager here at DBSA, and I have the unique privilege of working with our Young Adult Council. The Young Adult Council is a group of 18 to 30-year-olds that volunteer their time with us. YAC creates resources to share with other young adults that live with depression and bipolar. From blog posts to podcasts to social media, our members amplify the voices of young adults that live with mood disorders, and they generously share with our community their own stories and experiences. So this session will be a panel discussion where we're going to discuss the experiences of transitional times in a young adult's life. And we will take questions using the Q&A function. And if we have time at the end, we'll make some time for answering those questions. And as a quick note, unfortunately, we're missing one of our panelists today, Gwyneth, who could not be with us due to an emergency. We're all sending her positive energy. I hope you will too. And lastly, I wanted to point out that YAC has created a handout companion to this session, which you can find on the conference website. You can also go ahead and email me at programs@dbsalliance.org if you want me to email that handout to you directly. With that, I am so pleased to introduce MJ, who will be our moderator for today. MJ has been the chair of the DBSA Young Adult Council for the past 2 years, and through her leadership has helped expand the Young Adult Council to add more members and also expand the amount of resources they create each year. And we are so thankful for MJ's leadership and her moderation of this panel today. So with that, MJ, want to take it away?
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Hannah. Yes, absolutely. So I would like to first thank both of our panelists for being here, and I'm going to give them the opportunity to introduce themselves. Olivia, how about we start with you? Could you, share your name and give a quick overview of the transition that you will be talking about today?
Yeah, so my name's Olivia. I'm part of the Louisville, Kentucky chapter of DBSA. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the transition from high school to college. Just a little bit about myself. I was diagnosed with chronic depression and generalized anxiety disorder when I was in 8th grade, but I was able to manage it really well throughout high school, and that changed when I got to college. So I'll be talking about that today.
Thank you so much. And Maddie, how about you?
Hi, I'm Maddie. I am living and working in Chicago, Illinois, and I'm going to be talking today about my experience with the transition from college to postgraduate life and going into the workforce and all of the challenges that surround that.
All right, thank you both so much. So let's dive right in. Both of these transitions are, transitions that a lot of people go through. And my question for you is, how did you prepare for it, if at all? What were your expectations going into this next stage, and how did your experience differ from those expectations? Olivia, could you start us off?
Yeah, so this isn't the answer that I want to give, but it's the truth. I did not prepare for the transition to college at all. I think a lot of people, parents, school officials, even some healthcare providers have a tendency for children with a diagnosis to really link their wellness to academic performance. So if a kid starts, suddenly falling behind in school, the teacher might send them to the counselor to make sure, nothing's going on at home or emotionally. But in my case, academic performance was never really tied to my symptoms. So I always maintained grades and turned things in on time. And so I don't think there was, a lot of focus on what was really relevant for me. Providers weren't asking me, how much are you eating? How many hours are you spending in your room alone? Are you over exercising? And all of those would have been much more relevant to me. But as an 18-year-old going into college, I didn't have the knowledge myself to know that those were things that I needed to be looking out for too, and that I needed to hold myself accountable for. So I think, providers and patients and everyone taking a more holistic view is really important, because even though, the transition from high school to college is a big academic one, it's also social and emotional. So I think a broader view would be helpful.
Absolutely. I think everyone struggles with finding the right questions to ask. And at 18, it's so rare that we know those questions to ask ourselves and to take those moments for introspection. Maddie, how about you? Were you able to prepare at all for the transition out of the school environment?
Yeah, so, I did and I didn't. In the way, like Olivia was talking about, I didn't prepare for the transition itself just because I didn't realize that I would need to. I didn't take advantage of, going to my college's counseling office where I could have like set up some structures and some, support systems to put in place for when I left college. And I never took advantage of those free resources at the time, which I wish I had. But I did prepare in the sense that, I kind of did what I was supposed to do. I went through school. I went on and did 4 years of college and graduated with a degree. I was, had been on stable medications for a few years, and I had a support system, but life after college was nothing really at all like I expected. I struggled to find social groups, especially moving to a city that I didn't grow up in or live in for college. I struggled to find a job, which, I know many other recent grads have experienced as well. I ended up moving back to my college town at one point, so I can be near friends and, benefit from those connections in the community I'd made throughout college. So I really expected my expectations at the time were to graduate, get a job that I loved, make new friends, but it really was nothing like that. I was lonely. I felt stuck. I felt behind my peers. I could see people on social media, moving on, getting jobs, getting houses, getting married, things like that. I felt very behind. I felt like I wasn't ready to enter the career world, but I also wasn't necessarily happy living at home to take that time off. So it was hard, and it was not a transition in life that anyone in my circle was regularly talking about until it was happening. And then, we started to realize, okay, this seems like this is more normal than we thought it was.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that those conversations are important to have ahead of time, and so rare that we do have them. I mean, similar to both of you, I remember going through, grade school, high school, college, and just focusing on my grades because that was how, success was measured. And I wasn't really building any of those skills for monitoring my own mental health, my own just like stability. And then that's when those are the challenges, right? So when you start to experience difficulties, we might not have all of those skills because we haven't practiced using those tools before. So were there any difficulties that came up, any challenges in the process of your transitions that you weren't expecting? Can you name those, and what helped you deal with them? Like, did a routine help, or family support, or your peers? Olivia, you want to start us off?
Yeah, so the biggest initial challenge for me was, moving from this environment at home with both my parents and 2 siblings where, they weren't constantly watching over me, but you had, 4 people to keep you in check and keep an eye out for you. And then I moved 2 hours away to go to college, and, my roommate was busy. She had a ton of stuff going on. People in my classrooms didn't, if you're in college and you're in a seminar with 50 or 100 people, your classmates don't really notice you unless you introduce yourself. And so I've always been really good, to my detriment, at hiding symptoms. So, I mentioned I was diagnosed in 8th grade. My symptoms started in 5th grade. And I found that it got easier to hide my symptoms when I was away at college, just because there was no built-in person like a parent or an older sibling to watch over me. And so, it's no fault of their own. I just kind of fell through the cracks. And at the time, I was putting my energy towards, hiding my symptoms instead of putting my energy towards seeking help. Which, looking back, I wish I would have done the opposite. But that's really easy to say now as a 23-year-old with, 5 more years of life experience and 5 more years of treatment and 5 more years on my wellness journey. But, I do wish that I had flip-flopped those if I could have. But, no use, getting focused on the past like that. I fell through the cracks, but it was really no one's fault.
Maddie, how about you? What were the challenges that you faced, and how did you help, deal or cope with those?
Yeah, so I really did not know this, and I'm not sure how like any young person really would, but I didn't really know or have the skills to manage myself outside of an institutional structure, specifically academia, just because that was really what had been dictating my life for 16 years, from kindergarten to 12th grade, and then 4 years of college. And although there are some differences between your high school routine and structure to college, there is a little bit more leeway. You still have set deadlines, you have to turn things in on time, you have support with your schoolwork, you have classes you have to attend. So, and along with that, there's just a bunch of resources on campus that are there for students to help them out. So without school to guide me, it was incredibly easy to slip back into bad habits, especially after moving to a new city and beginning to work remotely because of the pandemic. And nobody was keeping me in check because I wasn't going into an office. I didn't have coworkers that I was sitting next to. So it was easy for me to, give into those depression symptoms, spending all day in bed, sleeping too much, never really having a reason to leave my house, or not having a reason to get up and do things on the weekends. So, creating a routine for myself had failed many times before I finally got the groove of things. And that took me a few years. I graduated college in 2018, and it really took me until halfway through 2020 to be able to accurately and successfully manage myself. So yeah, I almost gave up many times in between that time trying to set structures and boundaries for myself, because my brain just hates operating that way. I am always resistant to habits and routine, but I have found that is the way that works best in coping and managing my mental health. So I just kept at it and trying until slowly those small changes began becoming habit. And I'm better for having created a routine that I can manage. And I know now that I have one in place that works for me, it'll always be something I can turn to when I feel my mental health slipping, or, I am going through another life transition. And after years of dealing with a mental health condition, like I said, it's really only been this past year that I've realized I have some control over my wellness, and it is going to be better for me in the long run to set up these, structured systems for myself.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you're able to identify that for yourself and put those systems in place for the future. For a lot of folks, it is during these challenges and these transitions that they learn to self-advocate, usually just out of necessity, right? So this is where your network has a huge impact. My next question for you both is, what did that conversation look like with your loved ones? Did you express your feelings or needs to, family, friends, teachers? And it's a long question. How did they respond, and what did you find helpful or particularly unhelpful? Olivia, you want to start?
Yeah, so I actually realized that I didn't answer the second part of your last question, which is what helped me overcome that challenge of, being isolated and falling through the cracks. But in a way, it's good because it leads me to this answer. So unfortunately, what ended up helping me in the long run was a mental health crisis. So after my first semester of college, I came back home for winter break. At that time, it was just my parents at home. My siblings had moved out, and I attempted a suicide. And so after I was discharged, from inpatient treatment, and I came back home, one of my parents just really kept like an eagle eye on me. They didn't want to go to work. If I was in the bathroom too long, putting on makeup, there'd be a knock at the door. If I was in my bedroom with the door closed, even if I was just reading or something, they would want to come in and sit with me. And it was really overwhelming because it's like, I've spent this week in treatment, very intense inpatient treatment. I'm feeling a lot better now. And it seems like I'm just like in a fishbowl being watched. So something that really helped me was one of my siblings, my brother. He had gone through, some mental health stuff when he was in high school, not to the same extent that I did, but, he could relate. And so he said, hey, I know that parent can get intense. If you ever just want to come over and sit on the couch and watch a movie with me, you can do that. And, we don't have to talk. I don't have to ask you questions. We can just watch a movie. So that was really helpful that he recognized that, that's huge for a big brother to do. And I'm really grateful for it. So something that I've learned from that experience is that I need to set expectations and boundaries with how I want loved ones and, coworkers and, everyone, friends to treat me and what I expect and what I don't want. And I'm sure we'll go into this more a little bit later, but we've actually prepared a resource for how to have those conversations. So, maybe it would have been helpful for me to say to that parent, hey, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, a little, too watched. I'll check in with you, every 2 hours. How does that sound? So I think, that's luckily something that I've gotten a lot of practice at since then, and I've become a lot better with.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Olivia. I think, yeah, I agree that open communication is so incredibly important. And that's another thing that we don't have a lot of conversations about is how to talk about that, right? How to open up the conversation and how to set expectations for everyone and have, a plan, basically. Especially in times of transition when we can feel so overwhelmed that we're not stopping to check in on how we're feeling and what our needs are. So, Maddie, what was your experience with those conversations like?
Yeah, so for me, it was particularly difficult to open up about how I was feeling post-graduation. I feel like I was storing a lot of guilt and feeling so lost and unsure of what I was doing at the time, because my family had just, given up so much to put me through 4 years of college, and I wasn't doing anything with my degree at the time. And I, upon myself, felt pressured to immediately, put my schooling to use and to find a successful job and to start making money. And that's just something that I, wasn't in reality the case at all. Nobody was putting pressure on me from the outside. I was just putting pressure on myself. And once I started expressing these feelings to my friends who were all also post-graduation life, they began relating and opening up as well and admitting, they felt very similarly. And it's almost like a joke now between friends and I, and even other people my age, that, nobody knows what the heck they're doing at this point in life. And that's just how it's going to be for a little while. And yeah, it was hard because I really didn't know that many adults, especially in my own circle, who took a lot of time off after college or who jumped around locations and jobs and positions. Most of my family members entered the workforce directly after graduating from their undergraduate degree and have stayed in that same position or field for many years to follow. And that thought really overwhelmed me. Like I said before, didn't feel like I was ready to do that. Ready to even enter the workforce and start a career. And eventually, I did meet people, and including my stepmother, who explained and, comforted me in the idea that it does take a lot of people many years after college to really figure out what they want to do. And sometimes that can look like, something very different from what they expected, and that there's really no perfect timeline. It looks very different for each person, and that's completely normal. So it was really reassuring to get those perspectives. And I definitely encourage any recent graduates to just talk to as many people who have been through that as possible. Just, so you're not getting that one-sided view. You are going to meet people who have been in the same job for 35 years, but you're also going to meet people who decided to go finish their bachelor's degree at 60 years old. So everyone's timeline is just going to look different.
Yeah, something I think is also important to bring up in relation to this question is, how do you move on after, an interaction that wasn't the best? So, I mentioned that parent that was hovering, and really this is still hard for me to talk about today. What really started that strain was when I ended up, waking up the other parent. Physically they were closer to me, so it was easier to wake them up. And when I was in the car with both of my parents driving to the hospital, the other parent turned and said, "Why didn't you wake me up? Why didn't you tell me?" And so, I said that's something I still struggle with today. But I think it's really important, and as someone that has other loved ones with mental health conditions, to try to separate yourself from their condition. For instance, I've done suicide prevention stuff through DBSA while I was away at college, and sometimes it can be kind of hurtful if you have a friend that's been going through all this stuff and you feel like, oh, they didn't confide in me, they could have done that, yada yada. But at the end of the day, they're getting help now, and that's what's really important. Sometimes people that are entering a crisis don't have a whole lot of control over their energy or who they're going to ask for help. It's just important that they ask for help. And so in my experience, I would caution people from, taking someone asking for help as a sign of a personal fault, because it's not, and you can still be there to support that person on their journey. And after that conversation, it did take a couple years for me to become comfortable with that parent again. So I would say sometimes it can take time to heal, but ultimately just be comfortable in the fact that that person is getting help.
Absolutely. I think that ties back into what Maddie was saying about the expectations that we place on ourselves. And ones that we, might not be aware that we're placing on others. And the most, I think, that any of us can do for a friend or loved one with a mental health condition is just to meet them where they are and shower them with love and have that conversation of how is the best way for me to support you, and make sure that that person is, always in the position of self-determining their care, and because they know their needs best and they know what's going to make them feel safe. So along those lines, were there any supports or resources in place, either institutionally at school or in your network, that supported you through your transition? Olivia, you want to take us away?
Yeah, so I mentioned, my symptoms really started ramping up in college, and something that I didn't take advantage of until, the crisis and until I was out of inpatient was the counseling and testing center. And, for any parents on this panel conversation, for any students, a lot of universities have these kind of resources, and it's definitely worth checking into. I saw my first therapist when I was in 9th grade, and we didn't click. She was a family therapist. She dealt a lot with divorces and strained family relationships, and some people need that, but that's not what I needed. And so I kind of had a bad taste in my mouth from that experience. But I ended up going back to started going to the counseling center in college, and it was incredible. They had a staff of 6 or 7 licensed providers, and because they were focused on that college population, they were really able to tailor the treatment to my needs. And that's a lesson that I've taken with me since then. Now when I'm looking for new providers, when I'm moving or, whatever comes up, one of them leaves a practice, something like that, I make sure that I ask, potential new providers, do you have experience with people going through this diagnosis, this life issue, this challenge? Because, there's a lot of reasons to seek therapy, and therapists have a lot of different things they can be specialized in. And so learning to ask those important questions before really starting a deep relationship with a provider, I've learned is incredibly helpful in getting something useful out of therapy.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Maddie, what was your experience with resources during your transition?
Yeah, so very much unlike Olivia, I did not make the move to seek out, those free resources for myself when I was in my undergrad. My college did have a counseling center. It was pretty small, but there were definitely, licensed and great providers who worked there. And I just was doing pretty well and stable on my medications, and felt like I just really didn't have the time to take that extra step to go to therapy. And I really wish that I had, because although maybe I didn't necessarily need it at the time while I was in school, I could have, helped myself set up these routines and these systems for when I was going through the post-graduation transition, and instead had to kind of scramble to figure that stuff out on my own, which could have been a lot easier had I sought out those resources. So really, post-graduation, I did not have a lot of resources, because what was accessible to me throughout school was gone. So I was thankfully under my parents' health insurance for a few years after graduation, but I did end up losing it when my mom retired. And that was kind of a scary moment, to feel like I had to scramble to figure something out to get my healthcare covered, even though I, wasn't really working. I didn't have a formal position or a formal job that provided that. And even now I'm working full time in a nonprofit space, but they don't provide full healthcare benefits for us. So I've really had to find that I've turned to community resources that are out there and available. And it's been difficult for sure to take that upon myself to try to find those. But I have found a lot of, there are a lot of organizations and, public services within my city and within my state that, if you just do a little bit of digging and ask some people who work in these areas, you will eventually find resources that are out there. Even if you're not covered under healthcare in order to get therapy. There are free support groups you can attend, like DBSA support groups or community support groups that do a really good job of tiding you over until you can see an individual therapist. There are other general resources too for this transition time. When I moved to Chicago, I ended up just joining some random Facebook groups for, one of them for a girls hiking group, because I was like, I need a way to find and make friends, and I'm not going to be, feel ashamed to reach out to any network I can find within the community to, create that support group for myself. And it has worked really well. So yeah, I definitely encourage people who feel like they might not have those resources, especially after post-graduation. They are out there. You just might have to do a little bit more searching. But there's always going to be some type of community support backing you where you live.
Absolutely. I love that you joined a hiking Facebook group. That's so creative. That's so smart. Yeah, I agree. Finding like enduring resources is really difficult, especially when you're coming out of school and those have all kind of been baked into the institution. But that's, like you said, that's why networks are so important. That's why it's so great to be able to reach out to folks who are either familiar with the area or stuff like that. I remember earlier this year, I turned 26 the week after I lost my job due to COVID. And it was just like a 1-2 hit of, oh, I don't have an income and now I also don't have insurance. So, am I going to pay for therapy, or am I going to take my savings and put that towards rent? And that's not a position that anyone should have to be in. And that's why, like you said, like DBSA chapters are a great option that a lot of our, YAC council members participate in, local community support groups. Like there are so many really great, affordable and free resources out there. So much great community organizing that's happening everywhere right now. Okay, so my next question for you both is, if you could go back in time and say one thing to yourself as you were going through the transition, what would you tell yourself? What do you think you needed to hear?
Yeah, so before I answer this, I agree support groups are a huge part on my journey to wellness. And for people, maybe that are listening in or have loved ones that lived in rural areas, if you're in a town that maybe only has 1,500 people, there might not be a DBSA chapter there. But DBSA does offer a lot of online support groups. I can't give you the exact number, but I think before the pandemic, there were like 6 groups, and now it's up to dozens and dozens. So that's another resource as well. As far as what I wish I could go back and tell myself is something that I still tell myself today. I still have to remind myself. I mentioned earlier, isolation is one of my biggest symptoms. I've thought in the past, and sometimes still do, no one understands what I'm going through. No one gets it. Even if they do, they don't really care. And that's so far from the truth. And what really helped me realize that was support groups. When I was hospitalized, I had to go to group therapy as part of my treatment. And so the first couple of days, I was just kind of sitting in the chair shaking and not saying anything. But I noticed that no matter what somebody brought up, there was always at least one other person that said like, hey, yeah, I've gone through something really similar. Here's what I did. And that's something that's remained the same with all the groups that I've been to, whether it's DBSA or NAMI. There's always someone, everybody's unique and everyone's experience is different, but there's a lot of similarities. And so I always try to remind myself that I'm not alone and that there are other people who've been through things that are similar and they've come out on the other side. So that's been really helpful for me.
That's wonderful. Maddie, what would you tell your younger self?
Yeah, I would just, try to have more open discussions from the get-go with people. And I wish there was already more dialogue within our society as a whole about this transitional period from college to post-grad life, and entering the workforce, or even just from your early 20s to your mid and late 20s if school wasn't a part of your path. And I would just tell my younger self too that it's okay to move on your own timeline and to not have concrete expectations for what this life transition is going to look like. And just knowing that you may have this expectation or this idea in your head of what this period of life is supposed to look like or what you want it to look like. And that can be good in a lot of ways, but knowing that it's always subject to change and that it might end up looking a little bit or drastically different from what you expected. And just setting up a good system for yourself so that when you are going through that life transition and you start to notice some of those negative mental health symptoms creeping back in, that you have a plan of action. And that's just going to make any transition so much easier if you have those systems or routines set in place to know what to do and the steps to take if you start feeling bad again.
Absolutely. I think both of you touch on something that is, I think is hugely important, and that's just open communication and connection, right? And I think you both have kind of mentioned, how isolating it can be sometimes to be living with a mental health condition and to maybe not be living the life that you thought you were going to be living after school. And I think with both of those experiences, a lot of the time there's shame tied to that, and shame and feeling like you're the only one who is experiencing these feelings. And we don't talk about those things. And when we start to talk about them and realize that other people are having the exact same feelings, other people also have no idea what they're doing after college, and they're looking for work and they're not finding work. And other people are feeling like it's really hard to get out of bed in the morning, and they don't have the energy to talk to anybody. But when we start to share those feelings and realize that they're more universal than we realize, I think that helps dissolve some of that shame and really just makes us all feel a little more understood and a little stronger. So finally, we have a couple minutes here before we have to go into Q&A. Is there anything that you would like loved ones or caregivers to know? Olivia, you want to start?
Yeah, so this is like the happy side to the unfortunate parent situation I shared earlier. This morning, actually, I was texting with that parent, and they know that I'm hugely involved in DBSA, and they know about the conference, and they know about this panel, and they wished me good luck. I said, oh, thanks, I'm really excited for it. And then they said, I really wish more people knew about resources like that and used resources like that. So to any parent or caregiver that's listening, you're taking a huge step just by being here. As someone that's done mental health first aid with friends, I know that it can be really challenging and really draining and really hard to feel like you're doing the right thing and the best thing. But putting forth any effort is an incredible first step that a lot of people don't take. So the fact that you're here and listening is already a great sign that you're doing a lot to help that person.
What do you think, Maddie? What would
Yeah.
you like loved ones to know?
Yeah, definitely echoing what Olivia mentioned, and as well just trying to reiterate the one in your life who's going through that transition, that it's okay if they don't have all the answers right now, and that there's nothing wrong with that. That's completely normal. And just letting them know that you'll be there to support them throughout the whole process is, incredibly comforting within itself. And that they're their own individual, so their timeline might not look the same as yours or anyone else who's in their circle. And to try not to, force yourself to live up to those expectations or to follow the exact same path. It's okay to, manage your own. And also just, yeah, along the lines of what Olivia was saying, like, just be there to provide resources if you can do, some of your own research, because people going through these transitions might just not know what kind of support is out there, and not be able to take it upon themselves to look for that kind of stuff. So just simply providing some resources that they can seek out on their own can be a huge help.
Absolutely. First of all, before we go into Q&A, I want to thank you both so much for sharing your stories and thoughts and advice for everyone who is attending. And if you're feeling good, we can dive right in. We've got questions here. We've got a couple questions here. I'm gonna first just read out. There's some like fan mail. I'm just gonna read out. We've got 1000%. Thank all of you. This is so helpful, and I'm so impressed with these young people. Thank you, Jessica and Daisha. As a parent living with bipolar and a professional, let me reassure you that defining what success means to you is half the battle of deciding how successful you are. And that ties in exactly with what you were saying, Maddie. And interpreting external definitions just is comparison, right? Comparison isn't going to help anybody, and everything is just everyone's on their own path. Okay, so we have a question here from Jessica. How do we sensitively ask our 20-year-old adult child who lives on their own in an apartment and we don't know if they have depression or bipolar, how they are really doing and feeling? Also, do you think it's okay to ask for proof, like C grades, of how they are doing in college? So let's start with the first. How do we sensitively and nicely ask someone, our child who's living independently, how they're actually doing? Like, how do we, get that genuine connection and say, it's okay to open up and see how you're feeling?
Yeah, I can start on this one because I was just a couple years younger when I went through my experience. And I want to preface it by saying, in DBSA support groups, anyone who's been knows we can't offer advice. We can only share our personal experience. So I just caution that before I answer. But in my situation, if I didn't personally want treatment wasn't helpful. So when I started going to therapy in 8th grade, I didn't want to be there. I did know that I needed to be there, but I didn't want to be. And so it wasn't helpful. As far as starting that conversation, I think it really depends a lot on how the relationship already is. For a lot of people, mental health is hard to talk about. And so to expect it to just, switch overnight, if you've never talked about mental health before, it might be kind of strange to, just suddenly ask that out of the blue. So I think it really depends a lot on your starting point. But one thing that myself and the other members of the Young Adult Council that I've spoken to feel strongly about is, self-determination for those people, for young people, because there's a lot of difficulties in emerging as an adult. And ultimately it's up to that person to decide that they want that care and they need that care.
Absolutely. And I agree with that. I think, it's not always realistic to expect, you can flip a switch and go dive right into the really difficult conversations. And sometimes, everyone has to kind of flex those muscles a little bit of being open and sharing, parts of yourself that make you feel really vulnerable. Yeah, I think it goes back also to reinforcing the self-determination of the person who is living with a mental health condition or going through the transition. Maddie, what do you think?
Yeah, just to echo Olivia, like definitely in my experience, although I grew up in a household where, one and then both of my parents were mental health professionals, I still didn't want to open up to anybody about, my mental health struggles and issues. I was extremely resistant to it. And so I think the most helpful thing for me was to just have them kind of provide resources for me to, send me a list of support groups that were free that I could go to if I wanted to, or, a list of therapists' phone numbers to contact if I felt like I needed to, or even like offering to set up an appointment if it's something that they wanted to try out. Just because, have the more resources that were available to me, eventually I did find one that upon suggestion of my mom that I was like, oh, you know what, that is something I can do, and I'm going to do it, through my own volition. I didn't feel like anybody was making me do it, so I wasn't resistant to it. I decided to do it because I was struggling, and that's ultimately what ended up being the most beneficial for me. So just, surrounding them with as many resources as you can, and just, being there to be like, hey, these are here, use them, don't use them, totally up to you, kind of can kickstart something in people who might have been resistant to opening up about mental health struggles.
Absolutely. And it's looking like we have one more minute here. So Hannah, what do you think? Do we have time for one more question?
Let's try to do it if we can. I think if we
Okay.
go over a little bit, no one's going to get, this has just been such a great conversation. I'm so appreciative to all of you. You guys are awesome.
Yeah, thank you both so much. And thank you, Hannah, for coordinating everything. You are a rock star. Okay, the final question is, how do we talk to our 20-year-old about mental health? So this one, oh, and another more fan mail. You are all really amazing, awesome, and so inspiring. So how do we talk to our 20-year-old about mental health? And I think this also can kind of go back into the resource that Olivia had mentioned, where we actually made, all of us here, we worked and made a handout kind of printable sheet that has questions that'll get you started on these conversations. But yeah, aside from that, Maddie, Olivia, what are your thoughts about opening up that conversation?
Yeah, so lightning round. I would say a lot of it has to do with how you discuss your own mental health around your kids. I don't think you ever want to burden your child with super heavy things because they're not your therapist. But just, talking openly that it's okay to feel poorly, that's fine. And I think also being non-judgmental if they do decide to, talk to you about things. If they say, I'm really feeling stressed out, I don't want to get out of bed, XYZ, you probably shouldn't come back and say, oh, well, you've got a lot of great things going for you. It's okay. Just cheer up. Just reaffirming their feelings is really important to keeping that line of communication open once you establish it.
Yeah, I'm definitely on board with what Olivia was saying. And as well, just kind of, sneaking in those little like stories that, aren't obvious that you're talking about mental health, but, if you know of someone in your life or, another person's life who has gone through these things, just being like, hey, like, did you ever know about what our, Aunt Sandy went through? Like, that was a really rough time for her. And like, but look how she's doing today. Just talking about these things, at any opportunity can always be helpful, because it's more comfortable that way if there's already an open line of communication, rather than just diving in and being like, I know we've never talked about this before, but hi, how are you doing? How's your mental health? That's kind of scary. So just, trying to keep that line of communication open at all times, and normalize talking about mental health issues.
Okay, well, we are coming up on time. MJ, last comments?
I was just going to agree with Maddie and say structure always helps so much, especially with uncomfortable conversations. Either having like a set structure going into it, or being like, okay, we're going to talk about this and come up with a plan, and having sort of like an action item. That's really good. We have a question here. How do we get more involved? you can email us at DBSAYAC, right? No,
YAC membership at
YAC
DBSA
membership.
at dbsa.org. You go to the YAC page on the website. You can also email me at programs@dbsalliance.org. Happy to answer any questions there. And again, the handout that the YAC created for this session, that's on the conference website, and it will also go up on the Young Adult Council page on the website. Olivia just put it in the chat. She's so helpful. We're going over the time, but it's the last day of Leadership Summit, and this has been such an awesome session. I am just so appreciative for all of your insights, and it is hard, these transition ages. I remember mine wasn't that far away, and so I just appreciate your honesty, your candidness in this conversation, and thank you all so much for being here.